I'm here with Dr. Florian Zollman of the Department of Journalism, Media, Culture Studies and Heritage at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Dr. Zollman has been lecturing about Orwell, fake news, propaganda and militarism in an age of Orwell in the Department of Foreign Languages here. And I'm very happy to discuss with him his new book, which was just published by Peter Lang in New York, on media, propaganda and the politics of intervention. I would like to ask Dr. Zollman, what is the connection between Orwell and the field which you are continually researching, which is media, propaganda, journalism?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the book, the book is looking at media reporting of human rights violations, and the main theoretical framework the book is derived from is from a book by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent, and another book called The Political Economy of Human Rights, which is quite old, which is from the 1970s, where they looked at human rights violations conducted by different countries, and they found that if countries are connected to Western governments in terms of relations, say international relations or business relations, then the news media reports the violations by these countries in a different way than if countries are non-allied, if you like, or enemy countries, like say the Soviet Union, or then countries in the nexus of the Soviet Union at the time. So this book, The Political Economy of Human Rights by Chomsky and Herman, starts, I think, with a quote from Orwell, from Notes on Nationalism, in a way, because Orwell in the 1940s had observed in Notes on Nationalism, and I paraphrase him here, well, actually the same that when we look at human rights violations, or atrocities I think he calls it, then intellectuals in our countries, and he looked at British elites at the time, intellectuals, they also classify or may classify these violations differently depending on how their own country is related to that country. So that's what he said in the essay, Notes on Nationalism, in a nutshell. And so he basically said, when there are many, there might be many different human rights violations conducted any day, and we get information about them, and always said, well, but the way that our intellectuals will relate to them is really not necessarily based on facts. It might just be based on an ideological kind of lineage towards that country, whether we have a nationalist relationship to that country. So, for instance, if we have interest in another country, say business interests, which are important for our country, he would say, and this country might be a dictatorship or even be conducting human rights violations, then then we might not really relate to these kind of violations in a negative way, because this could impact on our business relations. So I mean, that's not really what Orwell said directly, but you can read this from the essay, that he found this. So basically my work goes back to that kind of assumption via Herman and Chomsky, who drew this, I think, from Orwell in a way, although they just quote him at the beginning of the work and they not necessarily base their work on Orwell, but you can see that, that Orwell quite early in the 1940s already highlighted an issue which I think is still relevant today. So my book takes this up, looking not at Orwell but at Herman and Chomsky's framework, which kind of provided case studies from the Cold War, and looks at more contemporary cases in the Arab uprisings post 2011, but also the Iraq War, to see how the US, UK and German national press, whether they have a similar bias when they look at different human rights violations conducted by different countries, if that makes sense in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the theoretical framework is applied in the context of mass media in Germany, the UK and the United States, is that correct? How would you react to any kind of questioning that might be directed at you in terms of why are you focusing on the media and specifically those countries, rather than maybe more obvious and gross cases of media manipulation, which we know exist in Russia, Turkey, countries which present themselves as democratic but are being very much questioned in terms of their democratic credentials?
I mean, I think there are two issues there. The one is, and I think that might also relate a bit to what Orwell would have said, or specifically, and also what other scholars like Herman and Chomsky say. So myself being from Germany but working in the UK, and being also somewhat related to the US, because the Germany-UK is, I think, quite closely related to the US in terms of similar interests in foreign policy. So there's some overlapping policies and interests. And I think being a scholar situated in that nexus, I feel rather obliged to look at my own countries and what they're doing, rather than looking at, say, Russia or say other countries, because what impact can I have on Russia? Probably not much. Whereas I probably can have an impact on my own country. And also in terms of being in a democracy, I think it's my duty to look at what my countries are doing in a way, or the kind of culture I'm from. So I think that's really important, that as a kind of academic, there is a responsibility, if you like, to look at your own governments and if they conduct any I suppose, issues that you think are worth highlighting. Then the second issue is, in terms of media manipulation, I don't see a big difference between media manipulation, say, in Russia or in our societies. And this might be striking to some people, but I think if we look at research and how media has reported, say, in the last decades, there's a lot of evidence, mainstream scholarship shows that the media has been highly constrained by various factors. So it's a different media system than, say, in the former Soviet Union or in Russia or in other countries. But rather than having, say, direct political control, there are other factors that also lead the news media to produce fake news on a quite extensive scale. And in my book, I show cases and quite systematic examples, which I can highlight if you want, to give you some idea in a minute as well. But certainly there are things in the news media in our countries which I think are comparable with biases you might find in other countries, say, like Russia.
One example you study in some detail in your book is the way in which the invasion of Iraq and the build-up to the invasion was portrayed in the UK media. That is a shocking example, indeed, of what you are speaking about.
Yeah, exactly. So in my book, I'm not directly discussing the build-up, but in the talk we had this yesterday, and I think, as you say, this is really the argument that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction was used to go to war. I mean, that was the main argument. There were some other arguments that the American-led coalition used to justify the invasion of Iraq, but this was certainly the main argument. And as we already knew by the time, Iraq didn't possess any of that weapons. And what might be worth to say here as well is that even if Iraq had been in the possession of weapons of mass destruction, we wouldn't, or the West wouldn't have been entitled to intervene, because in international law you're not entitled to intervene aside from self-defense or United Nations Security Council approval, which they clearly didn't have at the time. So even if Iraq had an atomic bomb, say, for the sake of argument, there could only have been an intervention if Iraq had attacked the US, which they clearly hadn't, or if the United Nations Security Council would have decided upon kind of such measures, which clearly wasn't the case as well. So even in that case, the invasion would have been illegal, as many legal scholars said at the time as well. So the bias in the media is to completely, or not completely, but to a large extent, ignore these kind of backgrounds. First, it was alleged that Iraq was in the possession of weapons of mass destruction, and secondly, the legal context wasn't really discussed in the news media at the time. But that, as mentioned, is not really part of my book. I'm looking at the occupation of Iraq, and there I suppose the bias is also very striking in the sense that when you look at the occupation of Iraq, you had a big occupation force, American-led force in Iraq, which generated huge levels of violence. And it might come to a surprise to people, but if you look at mainstream casualty figures for the first year of the occupation of Iraq, and these are studies by the Lancet, the most respected medical journal probably in the Western Hemisphere, as well as Iraq Body Count, which is a source that is often used in the mainstream as well. I make the argument in my book that the amount of casualties produced in Iraq in the first year or first and a half years of the occupation was higher than in the first year of the war in Syria in 2011, first and a half years. It was also higher than the total body count of the Balkan wars of the 1990s. But what impression do we have of these theaters? I suppose in the news media you learn, at least in the West, that the Balkan wars and the Syrian conflict were conflicts of extreme carnage, if you like. You don't get this impression when you hear about the occupation of Iraq. Nobody speaks of carnage in Iraq or the fact that actually Western forces have killed so many people there. So for instance, the Lancet came up with a study 1.5 years into the occupation that suggested that 100,000 people were killed in Iraq. And they say the majority of those, I'm literally paraphrasing from the Lancet, the majority of those were killed by US coalition forces using indiscriminate, using air forces and other military violence. And this kind of
bombing campaign.
Yeah, and also indiscriminate military force when they did say so-called counterinsurgency operations. So these kind of details are literally not discussed. So in my book, one argument I make is then to say, well, there's no assignment of responsibility there. So you might find in the news media that they say, well, the US or the West use too much force in Iraq, or they do the wrong tactics, they don't do it right. But the basic assumption is that the goal of the West was to bring democracy and stability to Iraq. And they don't say that, well, I think the real reason is that they're looking for the oil and they're looking for economic interests in Iraq. And by way of kind of enforcing these interests, they generated a national resistance which they had to fight. And during that fight, they probably killed more than 50,000 civilians in 1.5 years only. And that's just the beginning of the occupation. So later casualty figures go into 1 million. So the argument is that probably the Iraq war generated more violence than the Syrian civil war to this date. And certainly more violence than the Balkan wars. But in our kind of public understanding, well, the Iraq war and occupation was not really a conflict where we as a West generated these levels of carnage. So sometimes we might hear, well, there was a civil war in Iraq later and different ethnic groups, they had a civil war and killed each other, but our responsibility is rarely questioned there. And I think, also coming back to your first question, like Orwell clearly said in relation to 1984, in one, I think he said, as intellectuals we need to highlight these kind of issues, especially in terms of militarism, and our responsibility is to highlight if our country is engaged in these kind of activities. So I suppose I'm trying to do a small contribution there. There are many others who have looked at these things as well, and I think that's quite important. Yeah.
I think one thing which is striking from your work is that, not just in the book, but also in the lectures which you have been presenting and some of the articles that you have published, you point out basically a pattern of consistency whereby this has been very much the West's strategy in these conflict areas, regardless of whether it is a Republican President Bush, a Democratic Obama, the new Trump administration, which is considered very aggressive and assertive, but different from Obama and Bush before that, but nevertheless, overall, generally kind of, really coherent in terms of what they are pursuing in the Middle East. And also a Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in the UK. I mean, so people from, as such, very different political backgrounds and democratic traditions, by and large, are conducting these kinds of campaigns of intervention, propaganda, militarism in these conflict areas. That's something that strikes me from different aspects of the work that kind of come together.
Yeah, and I think that's, certainly the people you mentioned, they I guess on a domestic level, they might have larger differences in terms of their policies, and perhaps there are some differences also on an international level. So for instance, if you look at climate change, I guess the Trump administration is probably more dangerous than an Obama administration would have been. But on the other hand, if we look at foreign policy, American and I guess British foreign policy has been quite consistent since the Second World War, and we know from historians like the British historian Mark Curtis, who looked at the diplomatic record. So he looked at declassified government documents from the US and UK, and they consistently say in their own documents that, well, our foreign policy, I mean, to say a bit, to paraphrase here, but not directly in a way, but our foreign policy is not about democracy and human rights. It is about the national interest or business interest, translated to business interest, and securing a positive investment climate. And we can see that this is very consistent during the last decades. And I suppose whether Obama or Clinton or Trump, and you can see with Trump now that obviously the same policy interests are relevant, but certainly under Obama, where many people thought he would be more progressive, I think the same rationale applies. If we look at Clinton or Tony Blair as well, so if we look at the older documents, they say business interests, I suppose, are important. And if we look at actual policy, I think we can see how that translates into actual policy. And officially they might say we're looking for human rights and democracy, we want to bring these kind of positive moments, but I think at best they are secondary or tertiary goals. So if you can bring democracy to Iraq, that's great, but only if at the same time we make sure that we privatize their economy and the oil industry. If that doesn't work, then democracy will not be brought to Iraq. So democracy with a privatized economy, well, but not in a different way. And I think that's what you can see, what they tried to do to privatize the economy. It didn't work out in that way, but in other cases it might have worked better for them. And just to say, I mean, obviously, I suppose if we were to look at other countries like Russia or say China, they might have similar policy goals. And I'm not saying, I don't think we should be uncritical of them, but I think, yeah, I would expect, say, Russian scholars or Chinese scholars to look at these countries and how they do maybe similar things. But why should I, say, from a Western background, point my finger at Russia in that sense if I can influence what they do, and then leave our countries out of the picture? And you see, I think many Western intellectuals who look at Western governments, they like to point the finger on Russia because it's easier, rather than looking at their own country. And people like Chomsky or I think Orwell pointed this out very early on already, that this is not really good in terms of, you know, an intellectual culture. And I think we tried, at least with my lecture, I tried to kind of connect to Orwell and these kind of ethical considerations for scholarship, which I find really important, and because these policies have really repercussions as well.
You know, the counter argument, I think, would be that scholars in Russia and China are not at liberty to examine their own societies and political traditions critically, you know, according to the kinds of high-quality standards of academic research and inquiry which exist in mature democratic and academic cultures. How would you answer that? You know, so that people are saying, you have to help us out. Scholars in Britain and in Germany and France and Italy and Spain, elsewhere, Canada and so forth. You have to do this research. You have to get it going, so that maybe in China and Russia responses can be generated, and perhaps some scholars there may have a chance to interact and kind of become part of a global conversation about their own societies and traditions.
No, I totally agree to that, and I think that's very important. But what I find striking is that often we see that while we have or I'm saying we, but we're say in Britain or the US context or German context, there's a lot of scholarly freedom to engage critically with their own countries, but many scholars actually don't do that. So you find probably in many studies where scholars themselves would say that, well, our goal, say, in the Middle East is to bring democracy and these kind of themes which are actually not supported by evidence, but then they point their finger on Russia and China. So if I would say, well, if you point if as a Western scholar you point your finger at Russia, you should look at your own backyard first. So yeah, you can do that, and certainly we would want to support academics in other countries as best as we can, but I think ethically we can only do this if we are sincere with also what we do in our countries. And I guess my argument here is, say, if I'm, say, from Germany, I should look also at my country, so I can point my finger at Russia and say, well, why has Russia, say, economic interest in Syria, and they do a nasty intervention there, say, if I would say that. But then I would say, well, but my country wants to bring democracy to Syria or something, which I think is clearly not true. So I often see this double standard that we say, just because internally, say, some countries might be repressive, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're doing the same externally, and vice versa. Just because we are democracies, say, internally we have a lot of freedoms, it doesn't mean that our foreign policy is necessarily nice. So I think there are differences there. And again, Orwell, I think, was clear about that often intellectuals, and here I think he spoke about British intellectuals, are kind of deluded about British policy. And this might sound a bit mean, but I think we can clearly see that often, while maybe the research is factually accurate, we find ideological explanations. And in many studies I looked at, say, on the Iraq war and occupation, British scholars or German scholars, I mean, I look more at British and American scholars, they might include the assumptions in their work that, yeah, we tried to bring peace and democracy to Iraq, but it might have failed because we didn't apply the right policies and so on. But rarely do these scholars interrogate that, well, actually the Iraq war was in violation of the UN Charter. It would mean it's aggression, it's an illegal war, and you can translate an illegal war into something like bringing democracy. So, and again, maybe coming from Germany, that goes back to the Nazis, say, when the Nazis invaded, say, France and Poland and so on, that was the quintessential illegal war. And obviously the Nazis would have said they did this maybe to also bring nice things to these countries, or, you know, to support German minorities, or all kinds of propagandistic judgments they had. And I guess in the same way, as you could never argue that, say, that German invasion in France had any positive goal, I think if you have other illegal interventions, you have to apply the same standard. Although we have a different context, and the analogy are not always perfect and the same, but still, if an invasion is in violation of the UN Charter, whether the Nazis did it or, say, the US coalition in Iraq, it's the same standard. But you find in much scholarly work that these issues are not really interrogated, because, yeah, I mean, I think that's ideological reasons in a way. And while we have free societies, there can be repercussions as well, because we know, or at least some people wrote about that, again referring to Chomsky and scholars like him who might have argued that you could have career problems in democracies as well if you're overtly critical and so on, and there might be these kind of considerations to go somewhere where it's safer, if that makes sense. So while we might not face repression in the sense of totalitarian states, being overtly critical could lead to other, non-benign kind of repercussions. Although, I mean, yeah, I still think we have a lot of freedom to inquire these kind of things, and there's certainly a good amount of critical scholars as well. But critical inquiry might be inhibited by these kind of considerations as well. So, yeah.
I believe this happened to a number of academics in the US at the time of the invasion. I mean, there were not that many speaking up very loudly about this issue, but there were a few. And they faced very hostile reactions in the press and their own communities, even in their own schools, among their colleagues, sometimes their students.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. There are lobby groups, for instance, that might engage with contacting universities and so on, and this then can have repercussions. Although it shouldn't be the case in a democracy that this happens, but it's almost a bit like, I guess, like totalitarian kind of mechanisms in terms of putting pressure on universities because they are critical scholars or people who say certain things. But I think, well, we have academic freedom, and if something is inaccurate, you can disprove it. And I suppose, with the Iraq war, say, there are many legal scholars who actually wrote about this, that this was an illegal intervention. So it's not so easy to question that. And the same goes, say, if the Lancet writes about the casualties, say, again, that's mainstream evidence. It's not an esoteric a kind of body that comes up with casualty figures and so on. But if we look at, so again, if coming back to my book, the Lancet study completely ignored in the media. So you have the Lancet, really respected medical journal, coming up with a study that suggests that 100,000 people might have been killed within a year and a half as a result of an invasion that was in violation of the UN Charter. The Lancet didn't write about the UN Charter thing, but that's the connection. The media ignores this study. How comes that? So again, well, that's maybe literary, what Orwell would have called literary censorship in a way, but not by means of having a political commissar prohibiting that it's published, but maybe by means of self-censorship and indirect control of the press. So how comes that leading news organizations, they might refer to the Lancet here and there on the back pages, but you won't have a systematic coverage of the Lancet study. You won't have headline news, front page news. But then say, if the Lancet would have published a study, say, on a Russian, intervention in Syria, but they didn't, to my knowledge, but if they would have done that and they came up with similar figures, we can be sure that this would be on the first page or front page of the news media all over the place, because that's the enemy country.
The issue of fake news and related topics such as surveillance, propaganda, militarism, Orwellian societies, these are not going to go away anytime soon. Will this continue to be the focus of your research?
Yeah.
Do you maybe have a next book project? And if yes, what would it be?
I suppose fake news was there for a long time, but it was called propaganda, and I guess it will stay there for a long time. So at the moment, I'm looking at this conflict in Syria as well, and with some colleagues, we might do some research on the conflict in Syria, because that's, I think, quite an important conflict at the moment, maybe spreading to other countries, and I think that's quite dangerous. So we're interested in looking at the element of fake news in the Syrian conflict, because I touched Syria in my recent book as well, and what I found is that much of the coverage on Syria are often not based on first-hand inquiries. So the news media, they acknowledge that they didn't have journalists in Syria because it's too dangerous, and they rely on what they often call activist sources. And activists is often people embedded with the opposition, the Syrian opposition. So while it might be fine to look at some of the things they say, you certainly would expect the news media to look at other sources and come up with a complete picture. But in my study I found that much of the coverage was largely based on these opposition sources, as well as on what Western officials had to say about the conflict. And so you had a kind of direction of a discourse where Western statements, official statements, were aligned with what the opposition actors said, kind of against the government. And I'm not necessarily uncritical of the Syrian government, of course, which should be scrutinized as well. But it seems that the news media has been very one-sided there, and so it's quite interesting, I think, to explore this further, to see, are there issues that were suppressed in the Syrian conflict in terms of media reporting? And so, for instance, I'm looking at atrocities and how they're reported in my book, and I'm looking at future atrocities in terms of the Syrian conflict. Atrocities that happened after the case studies of my book. And it seems that often when there's an atrocity in Syria, immediately the Syrian government had been blamed. Although ISIS was in Syria, radical Islamist groups were opposition groups of the Syrian government who have a record of doing similar atrocities, and often evidence might point to them as being also responsible, or maybe being solely responsible. So, but the news media tends to often assign blame only on one side, and it's quite interesting to look at how atrocities are instrumentalized in a way to foster, again, foreign policy agendas. So, say, intervening in Syria to prevent atrocities allegedly conducted by the Syrian government, and to look into these kind of issues and to see whether atrocities might have been conducted by other forces. And I know that this is quite a sensitive topic, but I think this is something we need to look at, because again, if our governments say intervene in Syria using military force, I think it's our obligation to study whether they did this on appropriate grounds, or whether atrocities were instrumentalized in the same way as the weapons of mass destruction were used to intervene in Iraq. And I think there's some connection there. And again, this is not to be uncritical of the Syrian regime. I'm critical about the Syrian regime as well, but I think we should be objective as possible, and to see if other forces were also responsible in terms of atrocities in Syria. And I think there's a lot of evidence pointing to radical opposition groups and ISIS and other groups like the Al-Nusra Front, which were sometimes supported by Western governments, to see what they were doing. And I think my next projects will look into this, but I can't really say more about this at this stage, because the book is really just off the press, so I need to do some more research at the moment.
Before the next project begins.
Yeah. And there's some other stuff I'm looking at. So the lecture here on Orwell, I did some more research for the lectures too, and so I found some material which I might use for other publications as well. Maybe notes on nationalism, Orwell's essay on nationalism, to kind of turn that into an essay in terms of how this might still be relevant. But some think that Orwell said in this essay how this might still be relevant today. I guess to write a shorter essay about this might be interesting as well. Mm-hmm. So I guess our kind of conversations here and the lectures have kind of stimulated a further interest in looking into these issues, which is always interesting, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And on this concluding thought on the continuing relevance of George Orwell in the 21st century, we conclude this interview. I thank Florian Zollman for his reflections on these issues today.
Thank you very much for the interview as well.